Welcome to you all. We're here today for the webinar on the art of scaling deep. My name is Lisa Attygalle, and I'm a consulting director with the Learning Center at the Tamarack Institute, and I lead the community engagement area of practice. I am joining today from the lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral Peoples, and you are likely joining from various places across Turtle Island, as well as farther afield as well. As an organization committed to end poverty in all its forms, we know that this will only be possible through truth and reconciliation. As I was reflecting on this webinar topic and on the process of truth and reconciliation, I was struck by some of the similarities in scaling deep practices, in starting with the truth of educating ourselves, of reckoning with the harms of colonization. And by making those mindset shifts, that requires action, that requires reconciliation. And so I'm going to be holding that lens through our conversation today, and thinking about, for us, reconciliation means respecting the land and the waters, keeping our promises, partnering with humility, respect, and honor, and living forward in a way that brings harmony and balance, a world where no one lives at the expense of another. So I am excited now to welcome our guests today, Tatiana Fraser and Rachel Sinha, co-founders of the Systems Sanctuary. And both Rachel and Tatiana bring profound experience and thought leadership to building ecosystems and conditions for scaling change. So for our time together today, Tatiana and Rachel will offer an introduction to the concept of scaling deep as it relates to systems change. They'll unpack the work of the Systems Sanctuary and Ashoka Canada on the topic, which explores how scaling deep, a deep personal and cultural transformation to create lasting and sustainable change, can help you achieve enduring impact alongside other scaling strategies like scaling up and scaling out. So I encourage you to add questions at any point to the Q&A panel, and we'll protect time to respond to those at the end. So with that, I will welcome you, Rachel and Tatiana.
Hi, thank you so much for that lovely warm welcome. And a big welcome from us at the Systems Sanctuary. So I'm Rachel, originally from the UK, but I've been living in the US for about 8 years, and I live on unceded Osage territory, otherwise known as St. Louis in Missouri. And in a moment, we're going to do a bit of sharing of some of the research that's come from our work on Scale Deep. But I also want to start by just doing a bit of a kind of introduction to how we come to this work, like why are we doing it and where are we coming from in our kind of theoretical underpinnings, et cetera, So I can start by saying, yeah, so I'm Rachel from the UK, and I got into the world of systems change work because I co-founded something called the Finance Innovation Lab, which was launched after in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. And it was a partnership between WWF and the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. And really, it was an experiment in bringing together a really wide group of people who don't normally talk to each other in that moment of crisis where everyone was kind of blaming each other, to look at how can we have different conversations and support the leadership of people already doing really interesting and amazing work, to create a financial system that's better for people and planet. And so co-led that with some partners for about 8 years, and we span it out and it became an independent charity that's still going. And I moved to the US and became really interested and curious about how we support people who are doing system change work, because from my own experience of it, it was really difficult. And for many different reasons, like you have to talk to all of these really wide range of people and use a common language, or if it becomes successful, it grows really big, really quickly overnight, and you're bringing it home with you, and it's shifting the way that you see the world, and you're kind of unraveling different layers of your own perception and understanding of the system that you're working in. And so when I was kind of looking around, felt that there wasn't really a space to have a deeper level conversation about how are you doing in this work and how's it going for you. And so Tatiana and I founded the System Sanctuary with that kernel of an idea, and I'll hand over to her to give you a bit of an idea of her background and then share a bit more about what the System Sanctuary does today.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Lisa. And what a gift to be here with you all today. Really looking forward to sharing our learning and research around scaling deep. So a little bit of where I'm coming from in the work. I am living in Montreal on the traditional territories of the Kanakahage people. And I come to this work originally began as a co-founder of an organization called Girls Action Foundation, which was a national organization that supported the empowerment, leadership, and social justice of girls and young women across the country. And we started as a grassroots community initiative and scaled across, across Canada. And I share this with you because I cut my teeth on social change and systems change work, coming from an intersectional feminist lens and movement building. And at the same time, I was very fortunate to study with pioneers, systems change pioneers, Frances Wesley and Brenda Zimmerman, and was introduced to systems thinking and complexity theory specifically. And it was so amazing and mind-blowing when I learned about it. I was so excited because it aligned with the ways in which we were working, but it supported also the ways in which we were thinking about our change and our work and our growth. And so over the years, I kind of see my work as weaving together systems thinking, but also bringing in that feminist gender intersectional lens as well. And that kind of set the stage for the work and the thinking around scaling deep, which I'll share a bit later. But I was very fortunate when I left Girls Action. I was very obsessed with systems change, and I was fortunate to kind of join a learning journey with other leaders in Canada, and then met Rachel at that time. And we both came together around a vision and a shared commitment and passion for creating the opportunity for learning across systems, and a belief in the collective intelligence that can emerge through that learning to inform wise action. And that's kind of at the heart of the work that we do today. And Rachel, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, so today what we do at the System Sanctuary is two things mainly. So we teach and train people internationally on systems practice. We do that through a masterclass, but we do that also across an ecosystem. So where there's like a need to build out capacity and understanding of how we're using system strategy and language, we do that. And then we also create peer learning groups, which has always been really the backbone of our work at the System Sanctuary, these kind of spaces where we bring together people who are grappling with systems change, and create a space for them to share deeply the challenges that they're facing in a structured way. And I think what's special and important to us about how we do that is that we're trying to have a level of conversation that's at a certain level of depth, and we always start with a meditation, and we're slowing down and we're listening deeply to each other's experience, and kind of layering those stories on top of each other in a way that creates a kind of mental library of everybody's experience, and we can make sense of together. And we then, Tatiana and I, treat all of this a bit like qualitative research with permission of the people that we're working with, to capture the themes and patterns that emerge from those conversations, and are able to share that back with the field, to the field in different ways. So one of those ways is through, sharing in the field of practice, these are the common challenges that a set of people are facing. And another way is through thought leadership. And so, so we're really excited today to share with you some of the thinking that's been going for a long time in Tatiana's brain and has developed over this last couple of years with Scaling Deep. So I'll pass over to Tatiana to share.
Thanks, Rachel. So before we dive in, I really appreciate people introducing themselves in the chat. It's really lovely to see who's here with us today. And since we're not able to kind of see all the faces, I would love to just pause for a moment and just do a breath together, a small, it won't be a full meditation, but a pause so that we can ground and connect in to the circle of people that we're with today. So as we begin to kind of set up this the sharing, I'd like to just share a little bit of the story of how this came to be. the scaling deep process. So this, we began this work about 1.5 years ago, this research and inquiry in partnership with Ashoka Canada. They commissioned us to do research into the practice of scaling deep. And the inspiration for this has actually been a long time coming, I would say. So the scaling deep frame, I'll just introduce the framework in the context of and relationship to scaling up and scaling out. So scaling up is a way in which we've been thinking about systems change for a very, very long time. And scaling up refers to change that happens at the institutional level. So it's kind of the way we think about systems change. So it's policy change, it's change in rules, it's change in procedures, etc. And scaling out in terms of systems change is a way to think about spreading a good idea. So it's a replication of, say, a new model or a new way of working that we want to do more of. And so it's also considered a pathway and a strategy for systems change. And the idea of scaling deep came to me while I was participating in a research that, well, it wasn't really a research, it was a convening that Frances Wesley was hosting, and she was sharing the research she was doing on pathways to scale. And she had identified 5 pathways to scaling up and scaling out based on the research she was doing. And so as a participant, and we were in a room with lots of other social change leaders who were, experimenting with scaling. And she invited us to sit at the tables that represented each of these pathways. And so while some of them resonated for me, I was a bit scratching my head because I couldn't choose one table. And so there was another table. It was the other table. It was like, if you don't fit in, you can go sit on the other table. And so I did. And it was in that moment that I thought, there's something that's not full here for me. And I thought about our work at Girls Action and the feminist approaches and the community grassroots work we were doing. I thought, we're scaling deep. This sounds like there's a dimension that's missing. And so it started a discussion at our table that seemed to have a lot of energy. And from that point, it's been something that I've been like inquiring about, doing research about, and exploring all these years. And so it did have traction. This isn't a new concept. People have been using it. But what we have found is in our work is that while there are many people who are doing systems change work, those who tend towards the strategies around scaling deep are often faced with challenges where their work is not seen, not valued, not understood. It's difficult to communicate. It's difficult to prove impact in this current world and context that we're living in, that still kind of values outcomes, large numbers, impact scale. So this has been a trend we've seen over many years, and so the question was, how can we take this idea of scaling deep further? We want to understand more about how is it contributing to change, and how is it practiced? What does it look like? And what is the impact that it's having? Because there's a tendency to think about scaling deep as intangible, and we can't really touch it and we can't really name it. And so therefore it continues in this kind of undervalued, under-resourced reality. So scaling deep over the years has become, has been understood as the cultural change, the level of change around culture, and the level of work and change at a personal level. And that's kind of been the working understanding. But as I said, we're there's more here, and we want to inquire into that. So we did research. We interviewed over 25 changemakers internationally, globally. And as this was commissioned by Ashoka, we spoke to many Ashoka fellows, but not just Ashoka social change leaders. We also spoke to those who aren't a part of Ashoka. And we did peer learning as well to do some sense making and pattern finding. And to begin with, so I'm going to walk us through the findings. We'll look at the trends, some of the practices and strategies, impacts, and then kind of the nuggets of gold that I like to call. But to begin with, looking at the trends, what we found is that the idea and practice of scaling deep is in the zeitgeist. It's in the air. It is, people are hungry for it. They're attracted to it. They're doing it. They're curious about it. And it's important and timely. So given the context of the the world we're living in, the multiple poly-crisis moment of intersections of climate, of financial and poverty insecurities, of conflict, of polarization, there's a calling to think about this work and to practice this work and to center it. Again, as I mentioned, we see that it's undervalued and it's under-resourced significantly, systemically. So this was an important kind of pattern that we found. But we also saw that there's a lack of understanding of what it is and how to do it. Lack of language, lack of reference points, and a lack of shared language. So these were sort of the trends that we saw. And then we asked, okay, what is scaling deep to you? And so we started to be able to fill this out a little bit more than simply culture and personal transformation. We saw healing was a big part of that, practices around the personal healing and also collective healing. And then other dimensions to this came through the following kind of ideas, that it's where change happens. That scaling deep is actually, in the soil of where change happens, how culture shapes us and actually how we shape culture. It's definitely working at the root level of the issues. And it's working to change incentives, conversations, models, and how things are done. So there's this notion that it actually is the change. It's not just trying to create change. It also challenges traditional and dominant thinking, not only in the change sector, but in the business sector and in academia as well. And we also found that it is the work that nurtures and enables change. It includes a continual process of reflection and renewal and interconnected work and change. It requires slowing down and deepening. And it's the work that is required to inform action at other levels. So that scaling deep was often the work, the pre-work, the preliminary work, the first work before moving towards other dimensions of scale. So what does this look like? What does it actually tangibly look like in practice? And we found about 8 different themes, and I'm going to walk us through these. So the first is that it creates the conditions for healing at that inner level and that personal transformation. And we also found that it's work that starts where people are at and brings a strength-based, sort of asset-based lens. So rather than seeing the work that we're doing as like the problem or pathologizing issues, and then trying to fix them, and working from that context, it actually starts with like, where are people at, and what are the strengths that people are bringing to this work. It also includes reflective practice, empathy, and perspective taking, and we also saw very clearly that this is work that is heart and spirit centered work, rather than just the drawing on the kind of logic of the rational brain. It also includes practices that bring together and work with different ways of knowing, again, beyond just kind of the rational logical thinking, but embodied ways of knowing and traditional wisdom practices and ways of knowing as well. So that's the first. It creates the conditions for healing. The second is that it includes connection-based practices. And so it brings a holistic, interdependent systems view and lens to the work, and works in deepening relationship to humans, to non-humans, and it values that connection and nurturing as well. It also creates the condition to work across difference. So when we talk about relationship building and systems change, we hear a lot that relationships are everything, but we are also doing the work of creating the actual conditions to be able to work across difference. So whether that's context, community, identities, histories, cultures, sectors, right? Where it's building that capacity. It's also intergenerational relationship building, and it is the kind of work of repair and collective healing as well. So that was the second area, practices. And then the third is around shifting power. So in Scaling Deep, we bring a power analysis into the work. So it has an awareness of power and it's working with that consciously. There's also a recognition of agency, again, pointing to, rather than seeing, the work as, change agents intervening and creating change, there's a recognition of agency in multiple ways, and it values that and shifts the power by doing that. It centers lived experience as a starting point and values that and lifts that up in terms of leadership, in terms of practice and strategy. And it also includes processes of empowerment as well. And then we look to collective learning, which is something that is really important to us at the sanctuary. And when we looked at the practices around this collective learning, we see that there are lineages beyond the social innovation or systems change field. So we're drawing on lots of different ways in which change work and has been working with learning and collective learning. So those include practices like experiential learning, embodiment. That was really, really important, like practice that brings embodiment, and also land-based activities, connection and working with land. Popular education, which is Paulo Freire roots and is an old practice that's been around for a really long time. Reflexivity, so this reflection and action, cycles of reflection and action, and reflexivity, looking critically at myself and who am I in relationship to this work. And then also trainings and knowledge exchange were also key practices in collective learning. So next, working in emergence. So we saw strategies that were iterative and adapting, work and strategy that is nonlinear and also working in multi-dimensions. A real commitment to learning from history and taking the long view. So a recognition that this is long-term deep change, which is a bit countercultural to the urgency that we feel. The next is around narrative work, which included working beyond the boundaries of social change, recentering non-dominant perspectives. So shifting narratives by recentering diverse perspectives and visions and stories to help shift narratives. Creativity in the arts was really present, and also the practice of really trying to strategically create new narratives around the issues that we're working with. And finally, shifting patterns and fundamental reframes was key. So the practices of really, in a very micro scaling, deep way, initiating rituals, new habits, also seeing a change in the way people lead and the way they organize and the way they manage, and shifts from like traditional hierarchical structures to different ways, interdependent ways of working through networks, and other ways to challenge kind of hierarchical assumptions. And then a really important one, redefining success. So really challenging our assumptions around what is success and how we measure that and evaluate it. So these were the practices that we saw, and the strategies that people were using in Scaling Deep. And our hope in kind of naming these is that we can start to put some articulation and some flesh around this idea of what do we mean when we're scaling deep. We also heard resistance. There is resistance to this way of working that is real. And what we found is that the barriers are really rooted in the paradigms, the dominant Western paradigms that kind of saturate the ways in which we work and the way we organize. And these paradigms that value growth, that value endless growth, that see progress and development in a certain way, that still kind of value the individual and reinforce individualism, and that are still kind of rooted in sort of a business mindset as well, in terms of how it defines what kind of work is important or what is something we can support. So that led to funding constraints, as I mentioned earlier, that the Scaling Deep work is really hard to fund. And we heard over and over again how people often have to kind of contort to fit into the paradigms that define what is important or valuable or impactful, and that the scaling deep work then often is on the side, or is, you know, a cause for burnout, or is just simply not being supported and therefore not able to be done. So we also saw another, this connects, I think, another barrier is the traditional measures of success, the ways in which we're expected to define metrics, to define high numbers, to be able to illustrate high impacts, and that's really aligned with the ways in which the dominant sort of systems are operating. Also, the pace of change, you know, the challenge around the fact that there's an urgency to solve all the problems that we're dealing with. And that urgency often, you know, looks to the silver bullet solutions and the quick fixes and, you know, the traditional kind of hero leadership to solve the problems. Under this, though, also we saw the unconscious frames and biases that are rooted in kind of systems of inequity that continue to play out and are kind of blind to different ways of knowing, to different ways of working, to the value and power of some of the ways that scaling deep can work. And with that then comes a hesitation and fear that there's a risk and in supporting this work. So it's, the barriers are real. I don't want to, and we shouldn't underestimate them. And I do think they are clearly, explicitly embedded in the paradigm shifting that comes with scaling deep. It challenges those dominant paradigms that are still living and breathing and setting the agendas for the change work. So what is the promise and potential in scaling deep? This was really fun to hear from people. Okay, what are we seeing as some of the impacts, and what is the potential in this work? So at the highest potential, what came through is that scaling deep offers the possibility for deep, transformative, long-term, durable change. That it also creates new sites of power. So by shifting power, it's creating new sites of possibility and potential and power. It supports cultures and ethics of care and love. And when we think about systems change and we think about the ways in which we're trying to shift from harmful, violent systems, part of that is nurturing cultures of care and love. And how do we do that? So it comes through the deep work in the soil and by creating the conditions for change. We also see that the potential of that relational level change and intergenerational change. Scaling deep also has cascading impacts and is working at the upstream and offers possibilities of prevention rather than having to fix and provide band-aid solutions. It's also disrupting harmful patterns. So it is playing a role that is disruptive to the status quo. And that also leads to equity and trust and has the potential to change cultural landscapes and actually support healthy systems, to kind of align systems with life and shift from that unhealth towards health. So that's what came through in terms of what is that potential, what are people seeing as the impact of the work. So finally, I'm just going to walk us through, there are about 10 slides here that really capture the gold, I think, the nuggets of gold that we found in all of this thinking around scaling deep. So the first, it creates the conditions for change. So when you're working at that level, it's tending to the soil that will allow the new seeds to root and grow new ways of being in the world. It is embodied change. So it actually is living the change, embodying that in ourselves individually, in our communities, in our work, in our organizations. It's embodied change. It does shift power. So scaling deep does shift power. And I think this is really important because I think the power piece is really challenging, and it's important to bring that material reality into the visions that we have for the work that can often be idealistic or can feel like they're otherworldly and not connected to the material world. But scaling deep calls for a shift in power and is actually working at that level. Then scaling deep informs wise action. So that level of work informs wise action at other scale. So it can inform scaling out strategies and scaling up strategies. And the other thing we saw, which is really fun, is that, you know, when we think about scaling out, there are traditional ways to scale a successful model that looks like replication, or could be like blowing on the dandelion and spreading seeds. But in the scaling deep, there's actually, you know, this mycelium network idea, the ways of being interconnected and to share and to spread. There's different pathways to scale when we actually are starting from a point of scaling deep. And there's different ways to scale up as well. So not only does it inform, but it also creates other pathways for impact. This piece also is really important that we found, is that scaling deep directly connects to narratives. And so this is the power shift framework, and it looks at multiple levels of systems change. And I won't go into the full explanation of this so we can get to questions, but what we see is that at the deep root system, the work directly connects to the landscape, which is the area of narrative shift and impacting stories. And so rather than thinking about change and the heavy weight of actually doing work at the landscape, where often strategies think, oh, we have to be working with like heavy duty influencing media, or, you know, big players to have the power to actually influence narrative. There's actually a connection between the deep roots and the landscape, which is really powerful. And we see that in something like the Me Too movement is a good example of that. The other inspiration, I think, comes from the idea that scaling deep cuts across divisions. So in a world that is highly polarized and divided, and we're all working in that in so many ways, the fracturing just keeps happening in more and more different divisions, that scaling deep provides a space to actually nurture and discover what we can talk about as a middle path, or a third context that breaks us out of these polarities and actually can show other ways forward, or create the conditions for shared understandings and possibilities. We also found that scaling deep challenges systems of inequity clearly. Like, this isn't the meta systems that exist around colonization, around patriarchy, around racism, homophobia, that these meta systems are part of the deep work in the scaling deep practices, working with these meta systems and addressing those systems of inequity. And the last one, and this is my favorite, is that scaling deep expands beyond institutional change. So it's beyond the organizations, the institutional boundaries of the change work. And I think this is really important because there's more room for possibility beyond the boundaries of organizations for change work. And that leaves us with lots of questions. It leaves me with lots of questions. I think, you know, the change field has, and organizations have a really important room to play, but what happens when we can expand beyond those boundaries, and when we can, through that expansion, really explore change in other ways. And part of scaling deep is that tapping into human experience and humanity and being in other dimensions. So there we go. Thank you very much. That's our summary of the research. And I'm going to hand it over to Rachel, who will transition us into some conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tatiana, and thank you to all of you who've been chatting and doing Q&A in the box. So we will absolutely answer some of these questions in a moment. Lisa, did you have anything that you wanted to share before I pose the questions?
I'm just so grateful for you setting up the space to talk about the art of scaling deep, and I'm reading the resonance that people have with this topic, and the connection to equity work, and how essential it is to shift paradigms, to create. And I'm just thinking about the relationship between hope and scaling deep work. That, you know, does it create hope? Does it enable hope? Is hope required to enter into it? Anyway, my mind is alive. I want to say thank you. I have questions, but I want to go to the participants' questions first. So back to you, Rachel.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Lisa. Okay, so in System Sanctuary style, I think what we'd love to do is to just give you a minute to think on your own, because that was a lot of information, and we want to just give you a second to kind of reflect on what resonates for you in what Tatiana shared. You know, what questions do you have? How does it resonate with the work you're doing? Yeah, what does it spark for you?
I'll just respond to a few questions. Is that okay, Rachel? If I just jump in? Great. So one comment I read, which I think is important to say, is if I'm doing this scaling deep, is there a way I can connect in? And so Rachel and I, kind of our next steps around this work are to gather different ways in which, almost not like case studies traditionally, but good examples of the ways that people are practicing scale deep. And through the research, we have quite a bit of examples and stories, but we'd love to hear more. So if you are somebody who's doing that approach and you want to connect in to us, please reach out and feel free to share the work that you're doing. And our hope is to collect that and share that back into the world as well for others to see real life stories and examples. Another question that came in was, what methodologies do you use to inform scaling up and scaling out? And this, I can give an example of research that we did a couple of years ago in collaboration with 8 initiatives that were working collaboratively across Canada to impact systems around gender-based violence and economic security and housing. So these were systems change initiatives. They were collaboratives at multiple scales, but they were feminist organizations that were working to do this systems change work. And one of the patterns that we found is that they were working at that scaling deep level before they moved into their strategies to influence, whether to influence either policy or other levels of change that they were trying to impact. And that was the deep work of relationship building across the community. So it was very much starting from community, rooted in community and context, and then working to build relationships with other organizations, other communities, to be able to build sort of a deep understanding of the systemic issue, and then to collectively look at where was the best intervention, where was the best move at say a regime level or at a landscape level. And it was time, it was deep relationship work in intersectional contexts where there were maybe differences of opinion or politics or different strategies for trying to impact the change, and highly politicized, let's say. But that deep work was critical and important and created so much more power when they then moved in to, say, intervene to try and influence a policy or something else as well. So that's answering one of the questions. Rachel, did you see anything else?
Yeah, I thought Amanda asked an interesting question, which was about, if you've already been working in this way, how can we acknowledge the many people already been working in this way as part of the shifting of paradigms? So, Tatiana.
I think that's a really good question, and it's so important because the motivation to do this work came from the knowing that there were people who were working in this way that was so powerful, important, valid, and not centered and not resourced. And the question for me was, how can we shine light on this practice and approach and help bring awareness so that there's more support for it. And in that, it's starting from an assumption that this work is happening. And so I think what's really, really important is in our efforts is not to try and create a new framework that has like all the answers so that we can share it and teach others about it, how to do this, but more to connect the learning from those who are already doing that to build more power for that work ultimately. And so, you know, I think part of it is us sharing this. We hear a lot that like when people are in conversation with us, there's a huge kind of validation of like, oh my God, this is what I've been doing. And also this is what I've been doing, but I haven't had the language for it or the frames. And this is going to, now it gives me something else to kind of leverage to help advance my work. So our hope also is that through this conversation, we can build more momentum and support and validation and credibility for those who are working in this way as well.
Yeah, another one that's got lots of likes is around concrete examples for shifting patterns, reframes, and narratives. I wonder if anything sparks or...
Yes, so I think that this comes, there's many different ways that we can think about this. One of them was about like, what are the rituals that we are practicing? What sort of everyday ritual shifts, you know, creates that pattern shifting? So, you know, we can give examples like, for us, Rachel and I, anytime we're together with other people or we're hosting, we take a moment to do a meditation and to practice gratitude and to practice intention setting. And that is actually a ritual. It's a ritual practice that, you know, I think people can draw on gratitude practice or intention setting from many different wisdom traditions. So it perks up questions for like, how am I connected to these practices, and how can I create ritual that helps shift the way that a group might work together. And so this is really important for us, and we do it at every gathering or convening that we host. And then, you know, what does that mean then for patterns or ritual in an organization? Like, what are the practices or the ways in which regular heartbeat intentions are set in an organization to shift the patterns of the work? So that's a very small example. And I think in terms of narrative, that's a larger example. But narrative, so we were working in a world where there's sort of this dominant narrative around many of the issues that we're working with, which informs the ways in which we think about the issue, the ways in which we understand the underpinnings of the problems. And by shifting narrative, what we're doing is pausing and individually and collectively asking ourselves, you know, what informs this narrative? What is the belief system that informs? What is the voice that informs? And then setting intention to look at what other narratives are there around this, and how can we recenter other stories, other ways of understanding that can then inform the work that we're doing. So that's strategic, and that is intentional, and it's a way of shifting power and also shifting what is kind of a dominant assumed way of understanding a problem.
Cool. Okay, so yeah, the first question that was asked was, curious to know if you're linking young people to elders to support each other's journey. Thanks so much for this gathering.
Definitely. That's a really important practice, the intergenerational community building. And, you know, that can happen in lots of different ways. I know when I was working with Girls Action Foundation many years ago, what that looked like is we were working with young people and supporting young people's leadership, but we always brought elders into the space when we were convening, and we had intergenerational learning happening all the time. And then for Rachel and I, what that means is when we're engaged in our work, we're also asking the question, you know, do we have perspectives that come from a more youth perspective, and do we have the wisdom in the room as well? And that is also really intentional and important. Oh, great. Anybody who has any suggestions of people that would like to connect with us, please send them our way. I think our emails are in the chat, and some of our next steps are, like I said, to just gather more examples that are concrete, that could be case study related, and also I think connecting people who are practicing in this way, so that we can learn from each other. That's something that could be fun and interesting to do as well, and came up in our research as a possible way forward.
Yeah. So when you're creating systems change, how do you use scaling deep methodology to inform scaling up and scaling out?
Yeah, thanks. I already answered that one a bit earlier, but I want to just come back to, I think, a challenge that someone mentioned. A challenge that my team encounters is that our communities are attempting to practice scaling deep, but we haven't been able to move against some of the barriers that you named, and find it hard to sustain the work because of the pressure to produce and scale. Yes, that's a real challenge. And I don't want to underestimate that. And I think through this research that we can build an understanding and this frame of reference to be able to say, this is important, powerful change, and it needs resources and support. So I think we're the momentum to keep moving forward by sharing the scaling deep learnings, and to connect other learnings into it, so that this becomes a practice and a strategy that is easily understood and supported. And I think I think what was really clear in the research, and if you read our report also, is that because scaling deep is actually challenging the dominant paradigms, and it is embodying the change, it is pushing up against those power structures. And so it's helpful to know that those barriers aren't just a dismissal of that work or a devaluing, but it's actually because that work challenges the status quo. It is challenging the power structures. And so those, to be able to keep going, to be able to resource it through, the creative ways that we can, and to support each other to continue to do that work, I think is really key and important. Someone speaking here, Sarah. So deeply resonating, especially when scaling deep offers healing. I've been working on a scaling framework inspired by our Indigenous systems, thinking, and leadership values in the Philippines, and placed rooting and healing as part of scaling deep, and the approach to restoring and restoring the narrative. Thank you for that. I do think that, it's interesting, that the connection between the healing work, I don't think it's as obvious and as easy as I think, it may be out in the ether. And so there is work to do around what is collective healing, and collective healing in a way that is honoring, that is following those who are so skilled and who can guide this work in a healthy way. And there are lots of other questions. It's something that is really inspiring some of the thinking I'm doing and the practice work, because it's also very powerful and so important, I think, in the change work, and so out of the realm of the social change field. So thank you for that. I think that is also like an inquiry around learning that I would love to connect people into, and create opportunities for sharing as well.
Thank you so much for shining a light on the practices of scaling deep. I feel the energy of people wanting to understand, what does this look like? What does this feel like? And I'm as eager as everybody else for the next stage of your research too, and connecting with the ecosystem of practitioners who are doing this work. I was reflecting on readiness, and how, the scaling deep work creates readiness for the scaling up and scaling out. And you spoke about the iterative nature of that. So that's one of my parting reflections as I think about that tree diagram you had. So thank you so much for joining us today. We have, there is a feedback form in the chat. There are links to the report as well as to Systems Sanctuary. We will be sharing the slides in the coming days. And I'll just hand to Jaime to close us out.
And with that, thank you again for joining us. Watch for our follow-up email, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.